Sorry again for those who are in the room already. Hello, everybody. It is the beginning of the session, but I'm probably going to wait 2 minutes just to ensure that we have online and in the room attendance. Then we will start. So thank you for your patience. 2 minutes. All right, so let's start. So welcome all of you in the room and online. Welcome panelists. We'll introduce in a few minutes. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining this panel on cost effectiveness and investment in security risk management for operational continuity. And let's start by posing the problem. Humanitarian operations face increasingly complex risk environments. Crises arise, insecurity rises and continues at high levels, and resources tighten. Organization must make smarter, more transparent decisions about security investment, but the challenge remains: how do we measure the value of the security investments that are being done? The cost effectiveness of those investments, and how do we avoid sometimes the risk of false economies under cost effectiveness. So today, our panelists will, I hope, help unpack this challenge, bringing various perspectives, sharing initiatives and efforts that are ongoing at all levels on this topic. And I would like to introduce the panelists that will be joining me today. So we'll start in the room, FT Kios Mantas, or FT, as we call you during the panel, the Head of Security and Safety for Geneva Corps. William Blanchard, Bill, also shortening it, Director of Division of Field Operations for the United Nations Department of Safety and Security. Paul Farrell, online, the Principal Security Coordinator for UNICEF, and John Novakovic, the Executive Director of GISA. And I am Eric Le Guen,
UNHCR.
Forgot my title. Thanks, thank you. I knew the organization, I forgot about the title. Security Officer for UNHCR. So just on the logistics of the panel, we are planning to have a panel for about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes. Apologies, it drags a little bit. Then we're open for questions and answers from the room and online. So I invite participants online to post the questions in the Q&A function of the meeting, and we will get to them when we come to the Q&A session. So let's start with the panel, and let's open this panel by asking two simple questions: what and why? How should humanitarian organizations define cost effectiveness in the context of security risk management or investment in security risk management? And why is it important at this current time? And I open it to no particular order. Maybe Paul, since you are online and I have to turn to see you, any particular take on the what and the why?
Thanks. I mean, obviously in these times where there's a limited access to funds and our purses are being constrained, we really have to ensure for enabling programs and having our staff safe while doing these programs, we need to spend the money effectively, right? It needs to go where it's needed to have, as you know, the biggest bang for the buck. So I think that's why it's needed. The question is how to know that. It's very, very complicated. So I think I'll just start with the why. I think we can all get back to some of the hows, but that's definitely needed. In these limited access to funds, the funds need to be spent wisely. Now they have to be spent. I just need to say that before I pass back to the rest of the panel. And this is one of the key arguments I really like to make it during this panel, which is that security, cost-effective security, is not a drain on resources. It's an investment in lowering loss in the long run and enabling programs. So everyone knows that security costs money. Everyone can see those numbers. They know how to track the cost. But what we never do in our organizations writ large is track the cost of incidents, right? What does the cost of security failures cost us? And so we know the cost of security, but we don't know the cost of security failures. And my argument would be that without investing in cost-effective security risk management, the environment and the incidents will take more money out of us than the investments in security. And that's, for me, what cost-effective means. You end up spending less money out because there's less loss to incidents and failures. How's that for a beginning, this sort of framing of my view of this problem? Back to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I like your technical term of biggest bang for your buck. I know that in this discussion, several terms have been used: cost effectiveness, value for money, biggest bang for the buck, return on investment. We'll get to it after. But FT.
Yeah, I think we also need to go back to basics somehow in terms of how we define risk and understand in a common framework in terms of what do we want to achieve in this specific case. If we want to talk about understanding the effectiveness of security risk management, specifically when we talk about that, the definition that ISO 31000 gives, for instance, it has to do with the objectives and meeting the objectives of the organization in terms of security risk management. So when we talk about costs, as Paul suggested, it is very clear what is the cost. We can see the numbers in terms of human resources, in terms of investment on security. We also need to be able to track, as Paul suggested, in terms of what is the failure of security, but it's not, it goes beyond that. It goes on the fact on what is the cost of disruption of business. It goes in terms of how far we could get, and we are not achieving our objectives as humanitarian organizations because we do not have the right security risk management posture. There are a lot of discussion about get away from return of investment and go to return of risk. And when we try to calculate, again, the framework doesn't really matter. What matters, in my perspective, is to be objective oriented when we talk about, when we try to understand the why on this regard. And secondary, realize that, especially in our line of work, we will manage risk, we will manage crisis. This is inevitable. Business Continuity Institute suggested that 70% of organizations in 2024, they activated their crisis management plan. So having said that, the cost of security or insecurity in this specific case, it's also become clear. And that's why I believe it is important for us to see it as an investment and not as a burden or as a checklist within our tick box.
So I think I agree with what's been said. But I think we're also very conscious of the environment that we're in. Funders, member states, in our case, we're funded directly by other agencies in other parts of the UN, and we get some extra budgetary funding. Those budgets are going down. So the pressure on us to find ways of ensuring that we can provide security for lower cost are huge. So for me, it's that my definition, if I had to do one, would acknowledge that in some way. We're about delivering or enabling the delivery of programs, and the UN framework is that we allow or we try to enable it at acceptable levels of risk. So my definition is basically programs are delivered at acceptable levels of risk for the lowest sustainable cost. And I think we should be trying to find the ways of finding the the best value method of doing that. And there are some ways that we can go into. Happy to do that now or move on later.
Well, I guess we'll get to it.
Yeah.
We'll get to it after. But I like the fact that you added this sentence, second part of the sentence, acceptable risk at reasonable cost.
Yeah.
And that I think is something that is currently missing, but this is what we're here to discuss.
And it is countercultural because, you know, I've just been in Afghanistan talking to all the security teams there, and hearing me talk, people were asking the question, well, hang on a minute, doesn't security come first? Finances, you know, money comes second. Not that simple. And we can't ignore the world around us. It says we've made actually a 25 to 27% cut last year. But the UN still wants the same amount of security.
So I said earlier, I used several terms: cost effectiveness, value for money, biggest bang for buck to Paul. Then you mentioned return on investment. I guess it's a good segue, John, to discuss your framing paper. The ISF published a framing paper on return on investment, which has various concepts that need to be pushed or need to be considered. So can you please go to return on investment, what it is for security and humanitarian operations, and how do we define return on investment when applying it to SRM?
Thanks, Eric. GISF, we have 150 something INGO members. FD organisation is one of our members, and we got to watch up close last year as budget cuts came through, the number of security staff that were cut, and then through our relationships with the UN, we're also watching horizontal cuts being put through the security capability of these organisations. And now a number of different parts of organisations suffered the same fate, essentially. But what became really clear is that the security functions were not really able to defend themselves with a lot of rigor at the boardroom level. Everyone believes, yes, security is important, duty of care is important, but when they're looking at the spreadsheets and saying, all right, what's going to get cut? We can talk about how security is an enabling function, but can you prove it to the accountants to one extent? So we started working on developing a tool that could provide a quantitative measure of what is the return on investment. We all believe that there's a positive return, but we need to justify it. So we started looking at this, and the questions, well, the objectives of this are: one is to be able to justify your existence and justify the space in competing budgets, not just within your own organisation, but with donors. And then the second one is to efficiently allocate the resources. How do you know where the money should be spent? You're a very experienced security manager, you have a bit of an instinct about it, but can you justify that? How do you know that you haven't fallen into the trap of gold plating some risk mitigations? And is it worth spending a good chunk of your funding there? It applies not just to individual organisations, but it also applies to quantifying the value of shared services. So UNDSS is a shared service to the UN community. Organisations like INSO are a shared service to the NGO community. How do you justify that? How do you quantify and capture their benefits? And lastly, if we can start to build up a better quantitative picture of the return on investment, then you can start to justify interventions in duty of care like MHPSS, so like mental health support, because then you can say it's not just a nice to have, it's not just this is the right thing to do, but no, this is actually a really efficient investment because it keeps our staff effective and it retains staff, these kinds of things. So it starts to open you up to have a lot more strong, structured arguments, and it informs data-driven decision making.
So we're having this discussion now, and I'm wondering, has this discussion relatively new in a sense because of the current situation we're facing? Are there any particular issues, hurdles within organizations to undertake these cost effectiveness measuring, return on investment Andy?
I think this is very much driven from individuals, organizations, or agencies to an extent, and personalities in terms of the leadership on security and the leadership in general of the organization. For instance, in Geneva Call, we have created what we call security risk management ecosystem. That basically all the security data are fed in one platform that talks to each other. So we understand the cost of incidents, we understand the budgeting cost in terms of security risk assessment, and we started doing that before financial implications say, knock our door. Specifically, just to have a more complete security risk management approach. Because if you cannot able to understand what is the cost of your security systems, what is the cost of instance, what is this interconnectivity when we talk about security risk management, then in the end of the day, your security risk management is somehow incomplete. And the reasoning why we moved towards this direction, it was not necessarily because of the current budget cuts. Sorry, it was more about the reality, and again, what I said, back to the basics. And technology helps, and you can do that in a very cheap to relatively free type of approach, because we all have specific platforms that we're using. For us, for instance, we're using SharePoint. We build everything in-house in SharePoint with no cost, essentially. So there are different approaches that each organization have used, some more advanced, some less advanced. But I have seen this discussion happening nearly for a decade now to various organizations in different levels and different complexities, depending on the internal structure of the organization.
In terms of current efforts, try to get some examples. Paul, I'm going to get back to you because we happen to be in the same working group within the UN, looking at security risk management, and there is a current effort that's ongoing to look at value for money, and I'll ask you to elaborate on this. And are there other initiatives that are taking place? John, your paper is one, but what is being done currently? Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I want to tie a few things together as I get to answer your thing. And I'm interested in Bill's comment about the staff reaction, right? And I think that this often we hear this idea that, oh, it shouldn't be about money. That's not fair to staff. And I don't think this framing is the correct framing that people may have. It is not about staff, money first and staff second. It's about limited resources and spending it in a way that has maximum impact on staff security. Pretending there's more money when there isn't, it's just not a helpful start to this discussion. And so that framing that we're talking about money, therefore we don't care about staff, is not. And I'm sure Bill, faced that when he was there. It's not a correct framing, and I think it's important for all of us to agree. Now, of course, security risk management is meant to be a logical, structured way to prioritize investments, right? We're supposed to be able to say, based on our assessment of threat and our relative vulnerability, these areas are areas where we need to invest, right? We need to invest in this problem because it's more serious than that problem. But what it doesn't tell us is, well, the recommended investment is actually going to make a difference, right? And so that's, and making a difference also requires a clear understanding of what is the definition of the difference. And we just had this discussion in previous panels, right? What is the definition of good security? And it cannot only be that it's proven to lower impact on staff. It also has to be evaluated somewhere on the line. Is it also contributing to success? Is it also contributing to results? Because we could have perfect security that doesn't help results at all, right? That's the bunker mentality. So that's also important. But the other thing that we need to discuss is, are we recommending as security advisors and experts, or in a system as decision makers, are we putting forward security measures and procedures that actually everyone knows they'll make a difference? We have no proof they make a difference. And this is something on the lines of security theater, right? We all go from different places, and when different airports have different procedures, I mean, is this really matter? Does it really make an impact on our security, or is it just theater? Are we pretending or making people feel good by doing something, and that's a lot of money to spend on something that doesn't have impact. Now, there's a whole bunch of other negative effects of producing security theater, and one of them is that you lose credibility, right? Because people are not stupid; they know that this measure doesn't make a difference. Looking under a vehicle with a mirror when there's no bomb threat with that capability in the area, right? These are the things that we need to discuss as well, not just whether the measure works, but are we spending money on something that actually doesn't matter? How's that sound for a first intervention, Eric?
Always thought-provoking, Paul. Bill, on the efforts that are currently ongoing, because I'm aware of them, but
Yeah.
If you can elaborate.
Yeah, so I think this is such a big topic because you can approach the cost and the effectiveness of that cost in from so many directions. We had an effort before the financial shock last year to allocate our resources effectively, call it strategic resource allocation. We were trying to work out, between Afghanistan and Iraq, have we got the right quantity and type of resources? And that was helpful, in fact. I mean, we had to change it completely when we had the financial shock, but we had a mechanism for deciding, and the two key criteria were what is the size and scope of the UN activity in a place, and what is the security risk and complexity in that place. And under those, we had 10 indicators, and that added up to a signal. Now, that signal was just then the start of the conversation where we brought in the experts and the desk chiefs for the areas, and we discussed it and came to conclusions, but at least gave us a grounding. It forced us to ask the question, why does it seem like we've got more people given those parameters in one place than in another? But I think that's only the start of the discussion. And I really like the work that's being done in the SRM working group about individual measures, because that's very important too. But it's a difficult work. It's theoretically difficult because is the measure effective? Well, you could say, well, we don't have incidents that measure is protected, but is that because there wouldn't have been incidents anyway, or because we were well protected? And I have this argument the whole time when I suggest to people in the field that we perhaps overprotecting. And they say, yes, but the reason we haven't had the incidents is because we got the measures. And so that's an interesting challenge. I think there are ways of looking at it. Are there parallel organizations that have different measures, and what do they see? Can we test it at the margins? Can we reduce the number of places where we do armed guards or AVs, armored vehicles, and see what happens? Can we gradually relax things and see how far we go based on common sense and what other people are doing? So this question of gold plating, we need to avoid gold plating, and we need to make sure that our combination of risk assessment, risk mitigation, and risk acceptance, which enables programs to happen, is being done in the most efficient way. But there are things we can do. So we can ensure that any given measures, agreed measures, are met as cheaply as possible. We can choose on cost between alternative measures that provide the same levels of security. Just an example, we may think that the best way of, or we may have a system currently that says everyone must go out in an AV in a particular context of the threat. But when we experiment, we find that we can also do low profile missions in a different way, which may be cheaper, may in fact not lead to an increase in the risk level. So there's just may be alternatives. And I think we can check the necessity of particular measures using the SRM. That's one of the values of the SRM as a tool, so we can imagine a world where we don't have a particular measure, we take it out and then see through the algorithm what does it have, where does that leave us? We can change the boundaries of when measures are applied, and we can so that's measures. Talked about allocation of resources. I think we can also look more widely about the security related costs. the things I just described are only part of the security-related costs. In the UN, there's a whole load of costs around staff allowances, danger pay, R&R, and then there are costs about residential security for people living in dangerous places. Those need looking at, and we may find there's actually more savings in those areas. We can't change our rules, not without a big discussion, but we can check that they're being applied rigorously. And that's one thing we've been doing over the last year.
Just one last question that may be linked to the question that I had on like difficulty and disenabling. Paul, you mentioned security theater. My question would then be, and then gold plating was mentioned as well. My question would be: is one of the hurdle of this a culture? Does it require a culture change in terms of security having looked at measures as being the biggest, not necessarily the most expensive, but looking at security risk management and measures solely under security and not program enabling?
I think this is a complicated question, obviously, because it has a lot about the dependency between different departments and also in terms of what you want to achieve as an organization. But triggered a little bit from what Bill suggested, so to bring it also to the context of the NGOs, which is obviously different in terms of capacity and budget from the UN system. Versus most of us do not have the luxury of the big technology discussion. And most of the times, many organizations do not have to cut anything else, and then they need to find a way to cut more from what they already not have. Let's say better. What I'm trying to say on this is, I agree with you. There needs to be a change in culture, and the change in culture that I foresee that is the most essential, especially from the NGO perspective. I cannot talk about the UN. It's about try to be more interdependent to each other. For instance, we do not need, as Geneva Code, to invest and have our own analysis team from the security perspective. We can get and outsource our analysis from INSO in this specific case, because they're already doing a good job in many of the contexts where we operate. We do not need to invest time and effort and resources in terms of research, because the ISF is doing research that could be relevant for us, and et cetera, et cetera. So this silo approach that we suggest that we have avoided, in reality we haven't, is what we need to kill as a sector in general. And to speak about that, I think I understand it's going to be one of the subjects that we're going to discuss in terms of how we share resources, how we do things collectively. And this is, I think, in my perspective, the solution and the way that we need to start discussing and thinking as a sector. So this actually prompts a change of the culture where we try in a siloed approach to change and improve our systems. And to an extent, in some cases, we see ourselves as success story as departments in terms of how many staff do we have, how much budget do we manage as a security department, which is not the right way to approach that.
So I'm going to say, hold your thought on the collaboration. That's gonna come, and then that will be a segue also on something that I think Paul will discuss on, like security departments.
Eric?
Yes, Paul.
If you don't mind, I think this question is very important. If I could just add on to FD here. So I would say one of the main reasons why there could be gold plating or overprotection is a cultural question. And it comes down to, especially for decision makers, and I said this in the last panel, I say over and over again, right? Of misunderstanding the definition of success of security, and therefore misunderstanding the definition of failure, right? And if success is defined as, protecting staff, then failure is defined as anything bad happening. So if that's the definition, then people will throw all money at the problem to gold plate it to make sure that nothing bad happens. And that's why we end up, this is the clear cause and effect of incentives and risk aversion, right? And so a culture that sort of either formally or informally, sort of lets decision makers know your career is over if anything bad happens, then you're going to have people throwing all this money to make sure nothing bad happens. And it's out of perspective, and we don't know whether the money's being spent effectively. And I'll just lay one thing here on for all organizations that are listening, right? And this is why post-incident inquiry processes are so important in an organization, because how it's done matters to how risk-averse managers will be in the future. If we have a only accountability blame approach, it will just it'll dry up all risk, logical and rational risk taking, and make it super risk averse. If we have a learning approach of taking errors and go, okay, what did we learn from them? What did we know at the time, and what can we do better? Then we'll be less likely to become risk averse and less likely to gold plate and throw money at the wrong place.
Can I come in on the culture point?
Go ahead.
So yeah, absolutely supporting what Paul said. And I think there are some other cultural dimensions. One is that it's very easy to put in a request for more security or an additional measure when the situation gets tougher. What we're less good at is taking off a security measure or reducing a security posture when the situation gets better. We don't consider the up and the down in the same way or at the same speed. So what we tend to have is a legacy, a sort of high tide of security that there's quite a lot of driftwood still there from, even though the tide's gone out quite a lot and the security situation has improved. I think it's very important culturally that security management and security investment strategy is not left to security professionals alone. It has to be informed by programmatic importance and also by risk acceptance. And all Paul points apply. And it's for this reason in the UN system that the risk assessment and measure approval decision is not taken by security professionals. We are security advisors in the field, and normally the head of the UN in the field location is the decision maker. Now, it's not a perfect process, and the decision makers can also be risk averse if they don't fully understand the task. But that is deliberate and correct that it should not be security alone that makes the decision.
So FT, and then Paul, I'll get back to you on this idea, because I think you have a point on mainstreaming security functions.
Yeah, just very briefly to add on what Bill suggested. We are also quite bad in many cases in terms of proactively put systems in place when the situation is not already bad. And the reason I'm saying that is I've seen in recurring form a crisis happening, organizations run to cover the gaps that they have not proactively invested, and then pay a price of 60-70% higher than if they have proactively managed the security risk management. In Iraq, for instance, right now, with the current developments, to buy a generator is 70% more expensive than if you were buying that like 2 weeks ago. That's a very practical example that many organizations have been facing right now in locations like Erbil or Baghdad that they have not done this investment before. And I have seen that again happening again and again through many years now. On top of that, I think we also need to see, because you said something, I think, Paul, about convincing the leadership or the decision makers sometimes in terms of the investment. I think in many cases, if we want to have a critical evaluation of the security functions themselves, we do not talk the same language with some of the decision makers when we try to talk about security, because we're not focusing on the objectives. We try to convince them what is good in terms of security, but we do not focus on the objective. And that's why I started when we were talking about go back to the basics of the security risk management, be objective oriented, understand what success means, as Paul kept saying from the very beginning, because that could help us in terms of budget properly and proactively in a more effective way in terms of the budget that we request. And from my experience, in most of the times, it's more, let's say, easy to achieve than try to run the companies.
Paul, just to go along with what Bill was saying, I know you have this point on efforts in organization to mainstream security in management functions. So could you please elaborate on this?
Sure. I mean, I guess the next angle to speak about is a very effective, which can be very effective, but also very expensive security measure, which is human beings, right? So we're paying a security advisor can be a very, very, very good investment. They bring their brains and experience to a problem that's complex and unique. They can solve it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an extremely effective measure, but at the same time, it's very expensive and may not always be needed. And the other angle that we're getting at is the idea that that most of security risk management concepts in general are not rocket science, and therefore most human beings with regular in our organization can understand it and implement it, right? So in UNICEF, what we have is this concept of a security function that has to happen, which is actions and decisions taken to ensure we're enabling programs with acceptable levels of risk. But in that security function, there's an advisory subfunction and a decision-making subfunction. So what this does is it allows us to conceptualize the idea that the security function can happen even if you don't always have a security advisor there. And that's what we mean by mainstreaming, right? So there's a real cost-effective way of trying to get effective security within acceptable levels of risk and enabling by having managers and decision makers be more of the risk managers themselves, right? To take it upon themselves to understand and it's in their best interest. There's a business case for them. If they want to achieve their goals, they should understand the obstacles to their success, which are the security problems, and they should be able to figure out how to solve them. They still need security advisors to help them with specific aspects of different parts of the problem, but the general idea of how to analyze the problem and make priority decisions is not a remit of only security people, and it is not that complicated. And I'll just leave you with this one thought that we had when we had our global meeting in UNICEF at the end of the year last year about what role that security advisors play. And I just used this analogy from my personal life, right? Where I said, my young daughters are driving cars now, right? And then to have an accident in their car is one of the worst things that could impact my life. But I'm not going to pay for an individual safety advisor to sit next to them in the car every time they drive their car. It's just not cost effective. I want to mainstream that safety in their driving so they become safe drivers. You understand? So we also have to be clear in our organizations whether we're throwing a lot of money only at security advisors and not also at the capacity of our program and decision makers to understand and deal with security, because it's not that complicated. And one of the reasons why this may happen is back to our previous discussion. If decision makers believe they're going to be punished if something bad happens, then one of their sort of covers is I need a security advisor. If I don't have one, then I can't be accountable. And that's also part of the culture change. Back to you, Eric.
Right. Thank you very much. So I had a question on what should guide decisions, but I think we've looked at this at the beginning on the objectives and what are we trying to achieve with security, investments, duty of care, resilience, sustainability, delivery of mandate. But I would like to go back to you, John. Return on investment. One of the things I think was mentioned, cost incidents, we can't necessarily quantify. Is it missing in the equation of doing cost effectiveness or return on investment? What metrics do we need that we don't have that are still missing to measure the impact and the value of investment?
So there's a number of frameworks you can use to develop return on investment. Really basic one is cost benefit analysis. So that's total benefits, which equals the total benefit cost minus the total costs. So I'll give you an example. This illustrates why it's difficult. So let's say an NGO considers spending $20,000 on a vehicle tracking system. It's going to mitigate the impact of staff kidnappings during road travel. You've got historical data from that NGO that suggests a kidnapping incident costs around $200,000 in combined medical, logistical, program costs. And then based on recently available data, the annual probability rate of that incident is 2%. I've chosen these figures because they think math's easier. But this could give an expected annual loss of $4,000 per year. So if the tracking system reduces that probability to 0.5%, then the expected annual loss falls to $1,000. So you've got an annual benefit of $3,000. I know it sounds very, it's a very lot of accounting, but over a 5-year period, this is amounting to $15,000 in benefits compared with the investment cost of $20,000. So, right, you're like, okay, well, that's a negative, but you haven't taken into account at that point what is the programmatic benefit of being able to access that area? And what is the benefit in terms of getting new funding for an organization to say that you can access? But then that's not the only security mitigation that you've done. To mitigate that risk, you've probably trained the drivers. You've probably been maintaining the vehicles. You've probably got communication system. How do you allocate which of those mitigations was contributing to the reduction? So getting all the data in is really, that's what we're piloting the tool at the moment with about 12 NGOs, and this is what we're starting to realize. So overall, you're trying to get away from what this negative proof dilemma that Bill laid out, which is that if someone died, you didn't spend enough, and if no one died, you spent too much. Let's try and get away from that. So the big things we need to be able to do are capture the costs, which are very disparate, and sometimes intentionally so. Donors will say, the costs have to be in this bucket, in this bucket, this bucket. You've also got the indirect costs, you've got the direct costs, you've got, and then quantifying concepts such as developing and maintaining acceptance. We were just on a panel about this. That acceptance, generating it, is really vital to how we deliver security, but that's not just the security function's responsibility. And what's the cost if you lose acceptance? Right? Other challenges is that on incident data, there is a lot of really good incident data out there at the moment. So you've got a really good numerator. What we don't have is a great denominator, which would give us probability of an incident happening. That starts to get more of a stab in the dark about what's the likelihood. And so these are all the problems, which is good. That's the first step. And now we're working through mitigating those problems, starting to do some things such as assigning quantitative values to acceptance, drawing on the private sector. They've got some models that are relevant, like access to market. But really, what I can tell you now is that there's going to have to be a point where you look at what is the return on investment of knowing your return on investment for security, because there has going to have to be, as you would have found when you did your study in Iraq and Afghanistan, was it? There is a cost to get to that point. Now, you might, ideally, you're going to recover that cost over 5 years, 10 years, once you've got your systems working. This is a long answer to your question about what are the challenges.
And I was going to say, in this effort to try to justify or demonstrate, you give a few examples, but like, how do we cost disruption of programs? How do we define KPIs KPIs, by lack of a better word, but indicators that would allow us to demonstrate to our management, to donors, to anybody asking questions on why is this investment a good investment and what is it cost effective? That I think is the difficulty.
Well, just to jump in on that, there's a number of parts of this which are going to be uncomfortable for humanitarians. One is that you're going to have to ask the donors and figure out, well, you're giving us $1 million to save 1,000 lives or something. So that is the cost, the value you've assigned to those lives. And then on our side, we're going to have to start doing things like, what is the cost of one of our staff members dying? What is the cost of one of our staff members being off sick for 12 months because they had a traumatic incident? Because until you sort of grapple with those questions, then you're not really going to be able to accurately understand whether you're spending the right amount in the right places or not.
Now, I don't know, Paul, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, one of the basic principles, you don't spend $50,000 to solve a $400 problem, right? I remember one of the stories we used from the old days, this was before even DSS was formed, when I was UNICEF in West Africa, and we had, a couple of cell phones stolen from an office, and the unsecured advisor recommended we put in a $150,000 CCTV camera system in the office, right? While a few $1 keys locking up the phones in a desk would solve the problem, right? So it's a great idea if we could have the money, but we don't, and therefore it's really about being accountable for the recommendations of spending other people's money. So, but yeah, as colleagues said, it's very complicated to understand really what the costs are, including the secondary and tertiary costs of failure on access and results and staff morale, all kinds of things. It's very complicated.
Can I just come in on that? I think I admire the work, the return on investment work, because it's tempting something that I would have regarded as too difficult to attempt. So I admire it because of the complexity of security systems, the complexity of the different types of measures that are from a human being as an advisor to a training course to a vehicle to a comm system to acceptance to a decision-making process. These all cost. And they're parts of a complex infrastructure, and they're just very hard to sort of identify what is having the effect. Sometimes it's a combination of some of those things that give the effect. So I await the result of the survey with interest because I've been delighted to be shown that I'm too pessimistic. But I mean, I have a sort of pragmatic thing here, which is, what's the thing that costs the most? Let's have a good look at that. What's the thing that costs the next most? Let's have a good look at that. But thinking a bit more broadly than, what are the measures we're implementing in Afghanistan? How much does Afghanistan cost? Our people. And how much does the wider system cost with all the extra security related costs as I mentioned before? So I don't know whether the answer might be a combination of a pragmatic and a kind of economic approach, if we can get there.
No, and I would say hats off for starting it, and good luck for the rest. Because as you mentioned, as it is in the paper, I think, and Bill just mentioned it, we tend to look at measures as having a role in risk reduction, but it's a combination of measures that have an enabling factor to a particular program. So how do we break down what each measure brings as value to that objective? That's the, but that would be it. Now, one of the cost effectiveness strategies on a measure, strategy that's pushed, is this. You mentioned shared services, collaboration, interoperability, if you want to use various words. And this is something that people are discussing heavily within the UN, but also within the sector. Can we invest less individually in silos and more collectively? Is that an effective cost-saving measure? Does it work at all times? Are there good examples? Are there examples where we tried and it didn't necessarily work?
I think the short answer is yes. And the reason I'm saying that is because we have tested that over the last few years as a Geneva call, where we offered our in-house HIT training to partner organizations. And the cost, for instance, to a partner organization recently when we delivered that in DRC was $150 per individual, which was the cost essentially of the refreshing and the lunch that the staff got during the training. We did something similar in Sudan. The cost was 115. The difference of the cost was based on the context and the prices, obviously. It was not the organization tried to get a little more from one side or the other side. The person that went to deliver the training in this specific case was already budgeted from our organization. So it didn't matter for us to try to split the cost more. From the perspective that as part of our minimum security standards, that was a mandate that needed to be fulfilled. We had space in terms of positions to give to organizations. In fact, we gave 50% of the trainees were from partner organizations, and that's a cost-effective way to be able to achieve that. And based on what Paul suggested on the example of training the driver instead of have a safety advisor next to his daughter, I think this comes back to the effectiveness when we talk about security risk management systems. In some cases, you don't necessarily need heavy human resources. You need to train the staff on the ground that will take, in the end of the day, the decisions, and they know the context better than we will know from Geneva, New York, or wherever is the base of a security advisor. So for us as an organization, for instance, we saw the way that we are sharing our resources with other peer organizations is mostly in terms of training and capacity building, in terms of security risk assessment, security risk management in a proactive way, because this is what cut most of our costs so far, what we have seen, and this is what cut costs to other peer organizations in the end of the day. So this collective approach in terms of security risk management, I think it is something that can be achieved. In the first place, it requires, as I said earlier, a cultural change. We need to get out of silos. We need to get outside of our comfort zones and remove, our personal egos outside of the room in terms of who does a better job. Because in the end of the day, our objective as humanitarians should be more or less the same, to serve people in need. So this is
A resident.
my point.
Last year, John and I were on a panel. Bill was in the room. I think exactly this sentence was made. John made when it comes to optimizing donor funding and making sure that we spend money effectively. Some egos that can be left.
One quick note that I forgot.
Never seen egos in security.
Never. I calculated yesterday as part of this discussion, for instance, if a donor was giving $200,000 every year to have a trainer plus budget a portion of training for 600 staff, the cost of receiving HIT training that is easy to compare because usually it's 1,500 the cheapest vendor, 1,600 per staff, it will be around $300. So we're talking about a significant reduction of cost with only one trainer budgeted by one organization serving the community instead of serving a specific interest or a specific budget of an organization. It's a clear cut when we talk about money.
Paul and maybe Bill.
Sorry, FD, I thought you were stopping and I was going to jump in because I'm
It's
far
my
away.
Greek accent.
So I want to riff off of FD's point of it's taking the collaborative away from interagency collaboration to internal organizational collaboration, right? This idea of the role of staff themselves, right? I think this is a really important force multiplier, right? If in the UN security management system, we have a concept of security risk management measures and procedures. So it's not just something you pay for, but the human aspect of how this system's idea, right? And what we often see in failures, it's not the measures, it's the humans. That's where, and often when we put all the measures in place, what needs to be done is continually to maintain the processes and how people are working, right? And so we're going to touch on this in the panel and next on hostage taking. But what we realized in hostage taking was one of the most effective, security measures for hostage taking is not what we pay for, but the staff's active engagement in the security that we designed together, right? That is key, because if they're just passive consumers of security, it is very ineffective. So getting a culture whereby staff are actively engaged and are believe that they're able to make a difference and they are decision makers as well, really, really helps. We have many organizations have this belief that, central high-level authoritative control is what will solve a problem. And sometimes giving up that type of control to decentralized control where staff and people are making decisions, they're controlling the problem, and we need to trust them to do so and empower them and train them to do so. That really is an effective way of ensuring we have less incidents and more access.
Yeah, I think we in UNDSS, because we are a central and coordinating body for UN security, we obviously believe that is a more effective and likely to be a successful way and likely to be cost effective. But of course, it needs management, and we need to be clear about what counts as quality and good performance and so on. But I think, particularly now with the financial cuts, we run the risk of being quite close to the limit of providing acceptable security. So we need to make sure, particularly in the UN context, that we are allocating our resources in a rational manner. So we're not all ending up, with several agencies and DSS putting people in the same place, for example, and not in another place. So we're trying to coordinate on that. But I also think that a central provision, basically, there's a cost to fund the centre, but then the provision is free, is valuable and can be valuable beyond the UN. And this is the idea of Saving Lives Together, is that some of what we can do, some of the analysis, some of the contingency planning, some of the information sharing can help NGOs and INGOs. And at a time when everybody's budgets are down, then that is effectively, INSO is a similar concept in a way. I think the other thing is that it's not just about efficiency, it's about better security. If we were all making our own decisions, we had this discussion in the panel on acceptance, and one organisation decides to pay the roadblock to get through it, or another one decides to use an armed guard, you're potentially causing risks to other organisations. So the coordination, the benefit of coordination and having a collective approach can be done in a variety of fashions, but I think it's clear the benefit is can be both cost effectiveness and improved security.
One final point of that topic is collective approaches are really useful. GISF's been exploring that. You mentioned training. So one thing we've got underway at the moment is working with the NGOs to have a mutual recognition for their internal training, so that if FG's Geneva Call pays for a local partner to do a training, and then they go and work with World Vision can say, great, done, you don't need to do that again, we recognise that. Which do you think already existed? It didn't. Some egos around,
So if you could standardise heat and the UN's safe training, that would be a very interesting dynamic.
And then there's other aspects around which we've been looking at for the last year or so, is the collective purchasing power. So we all buy commercial services, whether it's insurance, training, risk management, intelligence, all kinds of things. So we all buy it. But the collective buying power can just drive down costs if we're willing to say and meet in the middle on what our requirements are, and sort of step back a bit from saying we're all special snowflakes, then we can benefit from that sort of buying power.
So again, good luck on that. I think the harmonization of long-term agreements and services on equipment is clearly a discussion that we also have. So, all right. So that would be. Lastly, I was going to say. So, in summary, a good security risk management measure, cost effective, and how does it look like? What does it achieve? Or an investment on security?
For me, I said that plenty of times already. I think we need to go back to basics. And when I say back to basics, we need to understand what is the objective of the organization as a core business. If we do not understand the objective of the organization, then we cannot measure what is successful security risk management in the first place. So if we understand that, then things are going to become clearer. And I understand that this may sound very, very basic, but from my experience and understanding, we don't have that in place in many organizations. So I think starting to back to basics, and there is a ISO 31000 as a framework that we can actually use. The JSF has produced a lot of materials in terms of security risk management. Organizations can choose, in the end of the day, which framework they need to follow, but they need to be objective oriented. So if we know the objective of the organization, then we can build our security risk management framework around that. Then we can talk about successful security or non-successful security. Then it will be easier for us to understand if it is cost effective or not. Because if you do not understand what success means, then you cannot even talk about cost effective, etc. Because you cannot measure effectiveness of measures if you cannot understand the success, the objectives of the security of the organization in general. On top of that, I think we can say that a holistic security risk management approach is going to be cost effective in the end of the day. And when I say holistic, I'm talking about incorporating all the small bits and dots from different systems and measures that we put in place. John mentioned about the acceptance discussion that you had and how much this moved around different systems within the same organization when we talk about how to achieve that. In my experience, when we talk about security risk management, it's never in a siloed approach within a security unit. Successful security is done by an organization supported by a security function, not by a security function per se. So this is my take in terms of how to move towards this direction.
Any supporting or dissenting views? None? None? None. All right, so. You. Yes, we're going to reach the question and answer part. So thank you very much for your intervention. Now I'm inviting people in the room as well as I have to open the Q&A and see what we have. We do have a few questions. So I'm going to take questions, probably 2 questions in the room, and then go to the online 2-1 ratio. So anybody in the room on the question? Yes.
Insurance. What is the insurance situation? How much is the rate or fee for insurance? Or is there any like officers and directors insurance or something like that? What do they put any conditions in providing the insurance?
I can take that.
Go ahead.
So insurance is one thing we've been looking at a lot lately. It's NGOs generally buy insurance from the same markets as an oil and gas company, as any company operating in a high risk environment. So they're not products by and large that specifically cater. And at the end of the day, an NGO is a legally registered company essentially, and so has got the same liabilities and that they have to manage, etc. So yeah, they operate in the insurance market. The insurance market doesn't meet all the requirements or the preferences of NGOs, and there's not a great understanding amongst the broker community of NGOs, which we're working to try and improve. Because if they can understand how NGOs approach security, they can give greater recognition for the professionalism of it, and then commensurate, ideally, premiums come down.
Eric, let me add something for the question in the audience, right? So just a couple of points on insurance as it fits all together in here. In general, we can think of insurance as a sort of risk-sharing approach, right? Where people pool money together and then some parts of it helps one part of that pool when something bad happens. But remember, this is always after something bad happens, right? And so what it does is it ends up lowering the impact on you, right? You have a car accident, they help pay for the car, but it doesn't stop the accident in the first place, right? And so that's why as organizations and in enabling our programs and keeping staff working, we want to avoid the incidents in the first place as much as possible. And that's what the effectiveness is also. Is it really helping avoid or prevent, as we call it, the incident or lower the likelihood of the incident? We cannot only deal with what helps us after the incident has occurred. So insurance definitely has a role to play in a risk management strategy, but it clearly is not enough when we think about how much we're responsible for lowering the likelihood of preventing incidents in the first place.
Other question in the room? Yes, please.
Yeah, a quick word of appreciation, then comment, and a quick question. Thank you. I'm learning a lot. I appreciate this very much. Seems very relevant. I've been in the sector 35 years as a clinical psychologist with my wife, working mostly on the staff support side. But of course, you can't talk about staff support without talking about security. There is a bias when we talk about security, it seems, to keep focusing, it seems totally appropriate in this context and other places, on corporal security. It was brought up a couple times already in the discussion about psychosocial support, trauma, and the reality of psychological damage and psychological risk too. And I know that might be set for another time. Just want to point out the consistent body of research shows that the greatest threat to staff well-being and programmatic effectiveness is not necessarily staff death or impairment through physical things, landmines and so forth, but it is through cumulative stress. And so anything we could do to help staff own their own well-being and managers own their own well-being and talk about duty of care in terms of two sides of the coin, security and support, including self-support, is really, really crucial. So having said that, I'm wondering if someone could just make a comment about local and national staff who often, if we could disaggregate the staff data for a second, who often are not the recipients for some of the many seemingly luxuries that we're talking about, to the staff security, psychosocial support and stuff like that. Where does the focus, or where does the emphasis on 90% of the workforce, broadly speaking, in our sector, what do we do for them that's different than our international staff? Because often they're left behind. And maybe you disagree with that, but I'm wondering if someone could maybe address that. And if it's not appropriate for this context, fine.
Yeah,
FT Bill.
just very briefly, in the first place, I agree with you that the necessity to talk about psychosocial support when we talk about security. At least within Geneva Call, we see that as part of our security mitigation measures. We're not seen as something different. So whenever we start budgeting in terms of security as part of our security risk assessment, we also budget on this regard, and we ensure that it is part of these discussions. It is essential. We cannot have it without that. Now, when we talk about local staff versus international staff, the practice is different from organization to organization. So we cannot have a collective answer on this, unfortunately. In speaking for my organization again, I can say to you that we do not see difference in between national and international staff beyond the capacity to relocate or evacuate, which has legal implications, obviously. But in terms of support, the support that we deliver is exactly the same. In reality, the staff, and there are a lot of research and data points from INSO, from humanitarian outcomes, from different platforms, suggesting that the ones that are have facing greater implications from insecurity, it is the national staff that are the ones that are most exposed. And again, the answer on your question is very much different from organization to organization. In our case, our focus in terms of delivering trainings and capacity building, for the exact reason that you mentioned, is to national staff, because they're the ones that are most exposed. And that's why I said earlier in Eric's question, I think a holistic security risk management approach is the one that is more appropriate, because a holistic security management approach essentially is the one that take that diverse profiles that we have in our workforce into consideration when we talk about security risk management.
Eric, can I come in?
Paul, yes. Bill first, and then you can come after.
Yeah, just to say, we agree that it's vitally important. I don't know that we've made that. I actually quite like to see the research that says that it's a greater thing, but I can well believe it. And we have in DSS, we have a psychosocial team of counsellors that particularly support incident stress related needs. I agree with you, long-term trauma is a clear problem. The UN system, in my view, aggravates it by not moving people around. We have too many people in difficult places who've been there for too long, and that leads to all sorts of issues. We do try and get, we do support national staff as well as part of that program. And where there are special needs, I've just come back from Afghanistan. You can imagine there's particular needs for the female national staff. We're looking at the specified dedicated support to that issue alone. So Whether we're doing enough of it or in the right way, I mean, that's a wider conversation. Yeah, we'd have that.
Paul?
I didn't get the name of the person who made that intervention.
Because the person.
Kelly O'Donnell,
Bill?
Kelly,
Kelly.
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 So I just thought I want to be personal and say thank you, Kelly, for the great question. It's really important. So the one thing I'm just going to say is a half an hour after this session ends, we'll have a session on hostage taking. Please come because we have a lot of discussion about traumatic effect of this. I just want to make of this type of security incident a hostage taking. I just want to say two things. In the UN security management system, what we did 10 years ago when we're updating our security risk management process and we're looking at our anticipated impact of future events, we did build in a psychological effect on staff. We raised it up really high. The traumatic effect on staff was considered as bad as injury for the purpose of understanding how serious an incident would be. And that was very important to acknowledge this. And then to add on what Bill said, how much we understand how much the staff needs support in critical incidents, and also the resilience in preparing them to be resilient in the environments they're in. We just finished a huge discussion with our staff support in UNICEF about their strategy and how these things are all connected. So I think it's a great question. And I just want to echo the answers on what we refer to at the UN as local versus international staff. In the UN, these are just two different types of contracts. And these types of contracts are linked also to the host government and what kind of employment law, et cetera. And we do not consider it any different when it comes to the UN in general. We call them personnel across the board and consider them all equal, and we provide same support, although there are some differences that we don't impose on ourselves. And that links to evacuation. This is more of a government issue about their citizens leaving the country, et cetera. We do consider in practicality that there has to at least consider the difference that someone was born in that area, hired locally, as opposed to someone who was on our behalf and our request placed in this country. And so this idea of whether someone is deployed there or normally there has a difference in some of the subtlety. So what we say is everyone's the same, but the toolbox that we have to help them may be a little bit different. But it's the same time the help is the same, the tools may be slightly different. I hope that helps.
All right, so I'm going to go to the first question in the first question I see. So it's one on building on what you had said, Paul, before on like mainstreaming security in managerial functions, but raising a concern. The concern being that there's a stronger and increasing emphasis on program managers taking greater ownership of operational security decisions without necessarily having the advice. And so I think the conclusion or the question is, one possible approach is investing in multi-role training, where program and operational staff develop sufficient security awareness to support informed decision making. Go on, you have your hand up.
I'm going to jump in. Steve Dennis' case is kind of useful. What it reminds you is that, as I said before, I don't know about the UN, but NGOs are legal entities who can be found liable for the duty of care for their staff if they fail to meet that duty of care. So even if you mainstream, I swear, if you mainstream the heck out of that, someone's going to be accountable and has to be accountable at the end of the day. And we talk about person-centered approaches and mainstreaming security, so I'm all in favor of that. You need to avoid the trap, which you see in all different sectors and all different industries around the world, of taking something which is a good idea and forgetting why you're doing it, so that in a year or two we don't find that actually we've just been getting rid of security positions because the finance team decided that was cheaper, and remembering why we were doing it in the first place, because it's so easy to fall into that trap.
Yeah, and I think that's what could be the definition of a false economy on false economies. But on that point, and I think, and I'm going to share there, move out of the moderator, move as a panelist. I mean, we have, it's not necessarily on that point, but I believe that there is a value in investing in training of non-security professionals on security aspects. And whether it is the security decision maker training that we're speaking about, or just as managers to get into these managers what's the tenets or the first part of security risk management concepts, since they are going to be, and I think it spoke to Paul, they are going to be the ones looking at programmatic and planning aspects, well, then they are better placed to start putting security from the beginning. I think we all say security is integral to programming and planning. But when you have two individuals that are looking at two aspects and not necessarily communicate effectively or not communicate at all, then you're not achieving this. And if you have one person that can take all of those components and put them into the programming and the planning and the programming, maybe it helps. So it is something, I think, on the multi-role training, people are trained as being programmatic managers, but doing a training to them, providing a training to them on security risk management, and even more when people are deployed to higher risk environments is an effort that at least we're doing with UNHCR.
I think we need to go to understand in the first place what is a problem that we try to resolve. We need to approach that as a project and actually follow the same project management cycle that we do in any project. So if we understand what is a problem we want to resolve, then we will start understanding what are the mechanics in terms of be able to have a solution that essentially is going to drive us to the optimal situation. The reason I'm saying that is because within the humanitarian sector and the private sector as well, we hear ideas or we find tools that are fancy or cool to do, and we jump to them without understanding what is the solution that we try to resolve. For instance, I remember I was in a previous organization in the past. The analysis of the incident that took place within a year led us to understand that in a specific country program, we needed to provide more trainings, while in another country program, we needed to invest more money in terms of hardware security, like doors, windows, etc., etc., etc. So a combination of needs and understanding of the core problem that we try to resolve, I think, it is the first step that we need to have. Because in some cases, indeed, we need to have more training. In some other cases, we need to invest in systems. So it is very much depending on the context. It is very much depending on what we define as a problem. And again, what I said earlier, what is our objective? What do we want to achieve as an organization? But I think Paul wanted to also say something.
Yeah, I thought I would come in. I'm not sure if people in the room can see what was in the chat, right? So in the chat, they're talking about can they, Eric?
They can, yes.
So the reference to, and I'm just looking at the chat where this this case, which we all know about, and quote, where operational decisions were taken without dedicated security advice, right? And I think that is not what I was saying anyway in my mainstream intervention. Just a couple of points for people to understand. Number one principle that the UN security management system is built on is that a lot of the issues that decision makers have to deal with are rare, and therefore they have no ability to be able to have the right experience themselves, right? So we need some sort of learning. I mentioned this about a learning organization. So the policies and procedures are meant to take the best practice and lessons learned and codify them so decision makers don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. They can learn from other people's learning and from other people's problems and mistakes, right? So that's the idea of yes, we have to make sure we're very informed. So in that, definitely they need dedicated security advice, but it doesn't mean it has to be everyone all the time next to them. So for example, in UNICEF, we use a layering process whereby we have headquarters and regional, and that's one regional security advisor can advise multiple representatives as decision makers without necessarily having to have a dedicated security officer next to them in every place. So yes, we definitely need dedicated advice, but the question is, what's the most cost-effective way to do it? Number two, can we help the decision makers learn themselves some of the things that the advisors know? And how do we make sure that there's an overall guidance and principles of policy and procedures that codify these best practices and lessons learned? I hope that helps.
Can I just come in on the final point, which is multi-role training? and just say that one of the most successful bits of training that we've done this last year was crisis management training that combined both security advisors and programmatic decision makers. And that the combination of both of them learning the same time, doing tabletop exercises and so on was incredibly valuable. Both sides found it really useful because they could begin to understand the perspective of the other. And we did it across different countries, which allowed them to, because the UN's quite country siloed, whereas most security problems are go across borders. And it also allowed for cross-fertilization in that way.
We have another question in the room, otherwise I'll go to the Q&A.
Thank you. Just a quick question, just anyone's experience. We all know about the challenges of institutional memory when we put the best policies and things in place for security, okay? You get new staff, there's transitions, we're all learning, we're all struggling, trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. Grace, sure. But the fact is institutional memory or lack of memory is an issue to deal with, as is personal forgetting. One standard case example is when you go through a wonderful Red Cross first aid training course. You learn all these techniques and skills, but if you don't put them in practice, when the time comes, you might not be able to put them into practice. So some kind of refreshment and ongoing input to make sure that when the rubber hits the road, when the stuff hits the fan, you could jump in and provide your operational security management as best as possible, knowing that you can't control everything and be fully prepared. So any ongoing training or any other perspectives quickly perhaps on this need for ongoing input? Not just you take the course, you check it off and hey, I'm ready now. I'm the manager, I can do this.
I see Paul nodding and he loved your question, your first question. So I'm going to let him go for your second question.
You want me to go first or there's a second question?
No, so on
Okay.
that question of refreshers.
Well, thank you for that. So it's a great question, right? How do we improve decision making and what role does training play in it, right? I just want to take your first aid analogy and apply it to the reality that we face, for example. And the reality is those we train are not going to be sitting by never doing first aid interventions, right? Because this issue of mobility and changing. So people will be applying these skills because they're going to be working in places where these are required. So what's needed is to have a process whereby advisors and decision makers are rotating around and being exposed to different environments. And that is not the same as doing a first aid course and never doing first aid. They are doing these things and they are engaging in these things on a daily basis. Now, some of them are more complex and more high threat environments, but that's what the mobility does. It allows people to go through these different environments so that the sort of on-the-job training, on-the-job exposure is keeping up their level of knowledge and their confidence and their ability to make decisions. How's that?
All right. And then we had another question, which was an hour ago. So my apologies for not getting it earlier, but I think we've partly answered this. Are we measuring the cost of security or the value of operational security enabled? I think we answered that from the beginning. And with the idea that security should be thought as capability and value generator rather than just a cost center. And I think, I hope for the person who asked the question that we've answered this throughout the panel on the fact that I think everybody nods and agree. Yes, it is the value of operational continuity that security enables. And this is where we can define that investments and measures that are put in place are effective or cost effective and have value is by enabling operational continuity or programming at acceptable levels of risk at a reasonable cost. So I think that's the sentence that was there at the very beginning. So I don't need to go up. I think that was the two questions. So I've got 5 minutes to close the panel. And I'm going to ask very briefly to the panelists. One takeaway for people in the room, for people listening to us. one change that needs to happen, one particular way of revisiting or reviewing the way we do business in order to get to that cost effectiveness?
So I go first.
Raise your hand first.
So first of all, I think we need to look at the whole cost and the whole benefit. And this conversation has shown us there are some wider benefits that we don't always capture, but there are some wider costs from security and security incidents, but also, security-related provisions that we don't always consider. So I think we should do that. And secondly, I just think at this time of financial pressure, we should welcome, and we do welcome, the challenge and the scrutiny, and we must find new ways of measuring our efficiency. At the same time, especially when money is tight, we do need to ensure that programs are sufficiently supported with security to be able to operate. I think in the past, we have occasionally found security to be a blocker because we've wanted to protect programs or people at any cost, regardless of whether the program can succeed. I think in the future, there's a greater risk that the absence of security or reduction of security will be a blocker. We won't be able to go out and do our programs because we won't have enough. So there's a risk of a transition in an unhelpful way there.
Paul?
My only final thought is we may not know what cost-effective security success looks like. We're still working on how to evaluate that. But I think staff and managers have an intuition on what it looks like when it doesn't work, right? What failure looks like. And people know that's a bad thing. It's about death, it's about injury, it's about trauma, it's about fear and uncertainty. And because it's so much fear and uncertainty, I would say as a security advisor professional, the profession itself has been given a bit of a free pass over the years to be able to, just because it's so important, just tell us what we need to hear and we're going to do it. And we haven't been, really accountable as much as we should be on cost effectiveness and et cetera. And we need to be. So professional, proper, well analyzed security advice is needed. And the fact that it's a very traumatic and emotional issue doesn't mean we don't have to stand up to the plate and meet that standard. Thanks.
John? Okay.
Yep. I'm going to try and end on a brighter note because I'm usually glum and pessimistic. And I'll say that there's opportunities when your funding gets cut and you've got less to work with. Right. That's a good time to question all your assumptions and question about how you do things and say, well, why did we do it like that? Did we have to do it like that? Maybe we didn't. And it's a time to innovate and create, and in a way that's happening at an opportune time because the nature of the threats are all changing anyway. So you've kind of already chucked the instruction manual out the door. So if we can embrace it with the challenges and the finding efficiencies and just remembering that efficiency is not just about how much it costs, but about how good it is, then there are opportunities.
Very much aligned with John, which was getting ready to give the spot to me and then you grabbed it. So I'm going to come as someone echo John right now. Sorry. What I wanted to say on that is, for me, one of the things I enjoyed in this panel, and that's a good that we had this discussion, is that I see disruptive thinking. And this comes as a continuity of what John said. We have a real opportunity here to reimagine and be creative and innovative when we talk about security risk management. I think to do that, we need to go back to the basics because somehow we got redirected ourselves to a different pathway for a long time. And with that in mind, I think that there is a big opportunity for us to an extent to essentially not only cut the costs, but also do better job in terms of security risk management and deliver and become what we considered ourselves as enablers for a long time, but in reality this time. So this is my final say on this, but I really enjoyed this panel.
Thank you very much. So for me, I mean, the takeaway from all this is I will start with, you know, in risk management, there's always at one point the way to capture that there is an opportunity. Despite something negative, there is an opportunity. And I think it goes back to what all of you said, and Paul as well. There is an opportunity now to look at things differently. Again, probably pushed by the events rather than an internal decision to look at it. But you know what? Let's embrace it and let's look at it. What I would say is it's a work in progress. John just mentioned it. They started. GISF started with a return on investment pilots ongoing, probably something coming. So I'm going to say I hope that things will have change in between. But let's meet next year at HNPW and let's have a panel on this and see what we've done in the course of a year to try to measure, try to guide, and try to obtain evidence of how to do things differently. So I'll stop there. I think everything has been said. I'd like to thank the panel, the four of you, for the thought-provoking and disruptive discussion. And again, I'll be happy to host, if I'm still in Geneva, but I'll be happy to host the same panel with the same panelists next year. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you very much for you in the room and online for the questions and the active listening. So thank you very much. And I was told, and Paul mentioned it twice, so I think I need to mention it a third time. I don't have the room number, but there is an interesting panel at 4 o'clock, I think, Paul, on hostage incident management. And I invite you to go if you're interested on the subject, but I'm convinced that it's going to be a particularly interesting panel with great panelists as well. So thank you very much.
It's in cell 3.
3. Okay.
And you would have to deal with Paul and
You're
me
gonna have to
again,
deal with the
so-
same panelists, but that's okay. You know them by now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
And have
Thanks,
a good
Eric. Great
afternoon.
job, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Thank you all.
Does that mean you have to do something?